Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the Massachusetts Institute for College and Career Readiness Skills Workshop. Today we are discussing logic models, and we're joined by our guest presenter, Laura Dziorny, who is the Chief of Staff at the Rennie Center, as well as Principal Investigator Scott Solberg. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura to go ahead and begin her presentation.
Great. Thank you, Livonia. So as she mentioned, I'm Laura Dziorny, Chief of Staff here. I think also good to note that as the email that went out mentioned, my previous role was actually working at the district level. So I was the Deputy Chief of Staff for Boston Public Schools. So in that role, I was involved with project management on a number of different initiatives at the district level. So that means that hopefully that experience gave me some level of familiarity with the challenges and the situations that staff are facing in the districts that are working with us through MICCR. And my goal is to use some of that understanding and that knowledge to inform the presentation today on logic models and make sure that it's framed as something that's useful and will actually be a very critical tool for the districts as they move forward with their projects. So before we dive in, I did want to just lay out some guidelines or ground rules for how to get the most out of the webinar today. So in case that we haven't already mentioned it, it would be very helpful for participants to mute the computer speakers so that we don't get any feedback on the recording. Also, please remember, if you're not currently asking a question or contributing a comment, try to mute your phone so that we do reduce the background noise, since obviously that can be distracting. That being said, we don't want to mute you, so participation is encouraged. In particular, some of the questions that you'll see will be written in green at the top of the page. In this case, green means go. Please jump in with any responses that you have to those prompts. I certainly will have my thoughts written down, but we also want to make sure that this is interactive and that you have a chance to share your thoughts. So I will remind you when we get to one of those questions, but certainly feel free to jump in either by phone or by typing in the chat box any comments or responses that you have at that time. That said, there will also be time at the end of the presentation in case you have any kind of overarching questions about the presentation. And also, of course, I'll share my contact information in case anything comes up afterwards. And finally, good to have a paper and pen available in case you have anything you want to jot down. There will be some opportunities for reflection on your own projects during the course of the webinar. So rather than having to switch off of the slides, it could be helpful to have something in front of you in case you want to write it down then. So with that out of the way, we'll dive right in. So the agenda for today, we'll start off by talking about what is a logic model. Second, go into why are those important before jumping into the components or the particular pieces of a logic model and how those fit together. We'll look a little bit at the process that you can use at the district level to come up with a logic model, what that modeling process could or should look like. And then get to a topic that I know is really critical for MICCR in particular, which is the evaluation and how does the logic model tie in with the different factors that are evaluated as the project goes along. We'll wrap it up by looking at a few common pitfalls of the process of putting together a logic model, and then we'll have, of course, the conclusion where we talk about resources and next steps. So the first piece that we're going to be looking at today, what is a logic model? So I think a good way to start this is actually to think about the term itself, because I know that for myself, when I in the past have heard the phrase logic model, that can be a little hard to understand, a little difficult to parse out what exactly that means. So it could be helpful to think about the pieces. So logic, of course, the relationship of elements to each other and to the whole. And a model is a description of a system, usually one that's more simple than the actual reality is. So when you think about those together, what a logic model really means is you have a description of a system in a simplified form that shows the relationship of different elements to the whole product or the whole project. Another way to put that is that it represents a program or a process, usually in a graphical form. It can be a picture. You'll see a bunch of different examples throughout the course of this presentation. Often it uses boxes and arrows and things like that. It doesn't have to, though. There are actually other ways to do it that involve other shapes, circles or triangles, all sorts of things that make the most sense given the particular project. A logic model also is a systematic way to present a process or project that indicates cause and effect relationships between inputs and expected outputs. So the cause and effect piece is one that we'll certainly dive into a little bit later. And then a crucial element here at the end is also thinking about both what goes in and what you expect to get out of a project. And that, of course, ties back in with what do we evaluate, what do we look at in terms of results. So there's a lot of different ways to describe it. Perhaps one of the easiest ways is to think about the analogy of the roadmap. A logic model really is a roadmap. It shows you where are you going, how you'll get there, and how you'll know once you've arrived. So as I mentioned earlier, there's not a single way to display a logic model. The one that you see here is kind of the classic form. In fact, it includes a little bit more than is normally represented. We'll talk about some of those other external parts a bit later. But the crux of it is the boxes and the arrows that you see kind of at the top and the middle of the logic model. That's the classic way to show them. There's also, though, as I mentioned, circular logic models. Sometimes these can be more effective if there's much more of a process, or if you want to show a continuous improvement cycle. A circular logic model can be really helpful for showing that relationship. There's also a lot of different ways or levels of complexity that can be brought into the logic model process. So some of the ones that we'll see in this presentation are extremely simple. Of course, there are also some that can be very complex. Now, if you've seen ones like this in the past, don't be scared away. This isn't what a logic model has to look like. And in fact, in a lot of cases, the whole value of the logic model, or a lot of the value of a logic model, is as a tool for communications. Therefore, something like this may not be the best way to represent the project if you're looking to communicate that with a broader audience. So again, don't be scared away from the concept, and don't think that just because you're already engaged in a project or a process that a logic model is not appropriate. In fact, there's really no single way to use a logic model, or no single time, certainly, to use a logic model. It really can be a snapshot of a project at any given time. It can be done at any point from project design, project planning, implementation, or evaluation. So it really is a way to demonstrate exactly where the project is now and to think about where it's headed. That said, the fact that it's a snapshot of a project does present some challenges. So in particular, a logic model is only a representation or a simplification. It doesn't capture the full reality of the project. It's really impossible to put in one single logic model the whole range of different external factors and contextual factors that can influence what happens. It can also be difficult to represent a logic model in a dynamic way. So that's really where the evaluation piece comes in. Evaluation can be used as a process of continuous improvement, getting fed back into the logic model in order to make changes or make improvements as you go along. So while it can be used at any point in the process, I'll be starting today pretty much from the beginning, kind of from the simplest logic model on, and also from the point of design, because I think there's a lot of value in having the discussion starting at the beginning. I will be hitting also, though, more heavily on some of the evaluation components, because I do know that that's where a lot of the MICCR researchers and district teams are perhaps most interested. So jumping from what a logic model is into our next topic, why use logic models? So as you see on here, to quote the late, great Yogi Berra, if you don't know where you're going, how are you going to know when you get there? And that's really the purpose of a logic model, telling us where are we headed so that we can track our progress at any particular point in the project. Also, before we cut in too deeply into why logic models are important, I did want to take a step back for just a second and recognize that what we're talking about here isn't just a process happening on its own. It's happening in the context of a school district. And so what might be helpful in terms of thinking about why logic models are important is to reflect for a moment on what are some of the challenges of implementing projects in school districts. Now, as you'll see, this is a question written in green. If anyone has ideas and wants to jump in, feel free. As you're thinking about that, I can certainly also answer from some of my experiences in the school district. So I'm sure everyone can appreciate the fact that districts are complex organizations with many competing priorities on time and attention. There are always a lot of different activities going on. There are a lot of operational and instructional initiatives that need to be carried out every day, regardless of what other projects are happening. So the school buses need to run on time, school lunches need to be delivered, all sorts of things that go into the function of a district. And so one individual project may not be seen as top priority at a particular point in the process. Similarly, there can be a lack or a challenge when it comes to staff capacity. People are very overstretched, have a lot of different areas that they're focused on. So what is to say that one project should get attention over another when you're fighting for these limited resources of time and attention? Of course, there's also the limited resource of budget, which has to be factored in. And because of all these different challenges in terms of capacity, it can be challenging at some points to convince others that an investment of time, resources, and staff attention is worthwhile. So this is something that's faced, I know, for a lot of worthwhile projects. People understand why their individual project, they have a very good sense of why it might be worth doing, but that's not necessarily the case for everyone. And finally, there's always the pressure to balance the short-term needs, whether it's doing something because it will improve student outcomes or student performance, or just because of accountability pressures with a longer-term outcome. So recognizing that many interventions only show results over the long term, how do you then balance what needs to be done today or tomorrow with the types of things that we all know need to be done over the long term in order to make things show serious and significant improvement? Now, I can't promise that a logic model will solve all of those challenges, obviously. However, what it can do is really help with the last two pieces, convincing others that the investment in a particular project is worth the investment or worth the time. And it can also help balance or reflect what the short-term needs are and what the long-term outcomes will be over time. So why are logic models important? To sum it up, they produce better design, planning, and communication of projects. In terms of design, what they really do is help think through a process sequentially. They force project leaders to think through the whole process before it even begins, potentially, if you're doing this in the design phase, that is. Laying out the project very clearly in a step-by-step fashion. Better thinking often yields better results. And so what this does then is develop a shared understanding right when the project begins of what are the goals and what are the processes that we're going to use to get to those goals. It also, though, for the same reason, avoids the trap of thinking that doing an activity is an end in itself. Doing something is not the same as achieving results for that. And so having a logic model will help us understand not only why we're doing something, but what are the results that we're likely to achieve or that we hope to achieve at the end of the day. And finally, it helps align big picture thinking with each individual part of a project or process. As we move from the design phase into the planning phase, the key benefits here are that it increases the intentionality and purpose of each stage of the process. So people who are engaged in planning understand why the work that they're doing ties in with the larger whole. The second one is also a really interesting part because, again, in a large and complex organization like a school district, it's very often difficult to identify what results are caused by what factors. So the logic model can help draw those lines of causality, both for people who are participating in the project and for others who are trying to get a better understanding of what the project is and what it hopes to achieve. It can also, because of that, help improve accountability for results. Now, this could be positive if the results are good, the people who are running the project want to take credit for it. It can also work the other way, though. So it can improve accountability from the perspective of if a project is not going well, it helps us understand what some of the key issues or challenges might be and how we can make changes in the project to improve those areas. And finally, as we'll talk about later, it can lead to more effective evaluation by clarifying what are the results that we're seeking and how those should be measured. In all of this, it can actually help, depending on whether a project is implemented well or could be improved, it can help determine how or whether we're going to replicate a project and bring it up to scale. So the evaluation component can be a crucial part, especially when we're talking about summative assessments or summative evaluations, looking at what do we do next after the project is complete. And finally, there's the communication component. So communications, in this case, has a number of different aspects. First of all, it's just basically a common language. So having each stakeholder talk about the different projects or programs in a particular way, having everyone understand what that means. It can also help with buy-in from district and school teams, and this is especially true if stakeholders are actively engaged in the process of setting up what the project is going to be and what the logic model is going to look like. It can help clarify what the project is and the process, and it can illustrate, especially to diverse stakeholders who may not be inside the district themselves or may not be very familiar with what exactly is going on in the project. It can be easier to understand what happens. So a visual display is often easier to understand than some sort of typed up memo or list of reasons why a project is going to do what we think it will do. And overall, as I mentioned earlier, what this really does, a logic model can help illustrate in a very clear and present way to stakeholders why they should invest in a particular project and what we expect that they'll get out of those projects. So for many of these reasons, these are a lot of the key factors that led into the development or the understanding of logic models as a useful tool. Logic models started to be used probably in around the 1970s, but they really came into fashion in the 90s and the early 2000s. There were a couple of key guidebooks that came out, one from the United Way, one from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And so these really came into vogue with private funders and with the federal government, those who are supporting projects, those who are funding projects. And they want their grantees to really think carefully in a step-by-step fashion through the whole process and also be able to monitor outcomes. So as we go on, or before we go on, I think it will be helpful to take just a couple of minutes for you to individually reflect and think about what would the major benefits be for you and for your district of being able to present a more coherent visual narrative that explains your project and its expected outcomes. So take about a minute or so, think through that. If you want to jot down some notes, that would also be fine. Hopefully you have something in front of you. If you did have any questions and want to jump in, again, feel free to do so either on the phone or by chat.
Yeah, hi, Laura. This is Scott. So Andy had posed a question in the chat box that seemed relevant to this as well. He was asking, as he's kind of perceiving, and maybe, Andy, if you're on the phone, if you want to ask the question directly, that would be great. It has to do with the perception of the initiative, of thinking about things at the initiative level versus the program and such. So, Andy, if you're on the line, maybe you could add a little more to that.
Okay, I see he's calling you out.
No problem. Got it. Okay. So
I can jump in and just give a couple comments in that. So I don't mean to give the impression that this has to represent a discrete kind of individual one program. I think that it can be used on a more initiative or at a higher level to look at a whole sequence of programs, or you can have a sequence of logic models that all tie together to try to generate that sort of systemic change. One of the things we'll talk about in just a minute or so is impact. So the question of the last stage in the logic model being what is that broader community impact or social impact that we'd like to see. And that could be something along the lines of changing the culture of a system or changing how a system operates as a whole. Program, if I say program or project, that in some way is really just a convenient way of kind of denoting what it is the subject of the logic model that we're looking at.
But in one way, then what you're describing at the impact level is tying it to a larger national initiative or district or state initiative, right? At the end, it needs to align up.
It certainly could. I'm not saying that it will, but there's a possibility there to show how it does align that way.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going with that, and I appreciate your insight. And I think a lot of times folks get caught up because they have so many programs that are kind of thrown at them, from their school districts. I feel as though the impact level, goals aren't really taken into consideration when programs are planned, designed, and put into action. I think there's a lot of focus on the short-term goals, the behavior change, the outcomes, rather than the overall impact.
Right.
Yeah. No, that's a good
point. I think
point.
you're right. I know with my faculty, that's a big challenge too, because they have a research project they want to do, and when you start looking at those short, middle, long-term impacts, it gets overwhelming to think that this small research project is supposed to somehow align with this larger initiative when I know I'm not going to be measuring it, I'm not going to be following them through. And I think and Laura, maybe you can comment on this, I think the point of the logic model is to help the investors and help the people that are interested in, say, the district or whomever the organization is. They're buying in because they see the value of the project as a component to help support leveraging those outcomes, not that you're expected singly to somehow do it all.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that.
Okay.
Great. So we've already jumped
Now,
a little bit
Jeannie,
ahead, but
yeah.
but that's
Jeannie, are
sorry.
you on? Yeah, I just want to see if Jeannie had a comment. I
Oh,
know she's on, but I don't know if she's on the phone, so I wasn't sure if she wanted to type something in. She may just be listening as she's traveling or something. So why don't we go ahead and move ahead?
okay, great. Well, again, feel free to jump in at any point. The next part that we're going to go to is the basic components of a logic model. So again, we've already given a bit of a preview, but helpful to go through more as a whole. So at the very simplest level, and you'll see how simple this really can be, a logic model is really essentially a cause and effect diagram. So I take medicine when I'm sick, therefore I feel better. Now, would you ever have to do a logic model for something like that? Probably not. But it's helpful just to keep in mind that as we move through a logic model, that's essentially all it is a series of causes and effects. Making it a little bit more complex, you can look at it as inputs that lead to activities, which then generate certain results. So using the same sort of theme, I get medicine, which means that I can then take the medicine with the result that I feel better. Now, these, again, are very simple forms. But truthfully, when you look at logic models, generally there are only a few more categories than this. So normally what you'll see are 5 separate categories in a logic model that kind of form the core of the whole model itself. The first of these, as we just noted, are inputs. These are also sometimes called resources. These can be human, financial, organizational, or community. So it could be the people who are participating, budget streams, key partner organizations, etc. Anything that a program or a project will have available that it can direct toward its work. Next is the activity. So what does the program do with its resources? What processes does it carry out? What tools does it make? What events does it hold? Any sort of technology or actions that it puts into place that are part of program implementation would come under activities. We also have outputs. So these are the direct products or the direct products of the activities that are put into place. So this could be the type of services provided, the level of service, the target of service, anything that's delivered by the program activities themselves. Moving ahead, we have outcomes. So these are the specific changes in program participants' behavior, knowledge, skills, or status. It can also be changes in actions. It could be things like changing behaviors, influencing people to make different decisions, or even changing policy when you get up to the broader level. And finally, if you're looking at the long term, it could be changes in conditions. So social well-being, economic changes, environmental changes. Significant changes that affect, kind of on a long-term basis, the way that the community or the environment functions. And finally, the piece that we already talked a little bit about, the impact. These are the fundamental changes, or intended, it can be intended or unintended, that are occurring in organizations, communities, or systems as a result of whatever the program is trying to achieve. So we have these different boxes in the logic model, and then the last piece is putting in the arrows, making explicit the connections between these components. The arrows also show the underlying causal connections. So as we mentioned, we have the cause and effect relationship throughout the whole logic model. What you see here are very sequential or linear arrows. Arrows don't have to go that way. A lot of times in logic models, you'll see arrows that cross each other, that loop around, that really show in a very kind of much more complex way what are the relationships between each of these different individual components. So before we move on and look at an example, I did want to just go a little bit more in depth into the difference, because this is often the most difficult distinction, difference between outputs and outcomes. So one more time, outputs are happening as a direct result of the activities that are being implemented. So if the program is something like constructional highways, the outputs would be designs for those projects, miles of highway constructed, or miles of highway that are reconstructed. The outcomes, meanwhile, are less about tangible accomplishments and more about the effects that an activity has. Usually these are effects starting on the individual, but they can also then over time be effects on the conditions or on the environment. So the outcomes of a program of highway construction would be that over time capacity increases, there's better traffic flow, travel times go down, and there's fewer accidents and injuries. So impact then, which isn't on here, again, would be the broader effect on the community or society. So the impact in this case could be more highways are constructed, and therefore travel becomes a more pleasant experience, or travel is something that's available for more individuals in the community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if we're going on, here is an example that I did want to take just a couple of minutes to walk through, because I think it's important to see kind of at a full level, not just these simplified versions we've been looking at so far, what does a logic model look like? So this is a logic model that's about preventing tobacco use among young people. And I'm not showing it because it's perfect. Certainly, I think there are things that can be improved, which I'll point out. But it does kind of have a good representation of each level of this process. So the first level, you have the inputs. The inputs, so in this case, this is, I think, one of the areas where this logic model could be improved. They talk only here about, or they only mention state health departments and partners. There's certainly a lot of other things that could go in at this level too. So budgetary streams, other sorts of community resources that are available. They could list out the particular partners, that sort of thing. They do a good job listing out the different activities though. So what are the things, what are the ways that we use our resources to try to achieve the strategies that we've laid out? That could be things like counter-marketing, school prevention, and policy changes. Those activities then lead directly to certain tangible outputs. So for instance, the tangible output of community mobilization, you'll see, is that youth advocacy groups are formed and that there are restrictions placed on tobacco sales to minors. They've broken apart their outcomes here, which you'll often see, into 3 time frames, the short-term, intermediate, and long-term. So as you'll see on there, short-term outcomes are things like more knowledge, awareness, skills, and changes in attitude, decreased access to tobacco. Those both together then lead on to the intermediate outcome, where smoking is denormalized among youth. And then that in turn leads on to the long-term outcome of reduced initiation of using tobacco products among youth. Finally, they don't label it this way on here, but going down to the bottom, you look at the broader societal impact, things like reduced tobacco-related morbidity and mortality, and decreased health disparities related to tobacco usage.
Can I pause you there then, Laura? Or I'm not sure the next slide I want to, but just to kind of put it in a research focus then. It seems like it would, I'm thinking of Jeannie, we were talking about a project that she was thinking about, or that we were talking about it, where we might do an actual study of a particular phenomenon. And when you talk about output then, the output could be the results, right, of the study, could be generating the results to be an output, as well as the communication materials to translate those results to a broader set of audiences or stakeholders. And then the outcome could be helping the larger community coalesce around a common understanding related to it. And then that could be the short term. And intermediate could be then looking to design programs to address the results or the challenges that are found in the results. Would that be fair enough?
Absolutely. Okay. I think that's a great analogy. Yep.
Okay. All right.
Great. So moving on, just one more note on this. So we talked a little about the cause and effect, but I think it's also important to note that when reading a logic model, it's helpful to think about it as a series of if-then statements. So each box, each component should lead on to as a cause of the box that comes next. So if you see here, resources are needed to operate the program. Moving on, if you have access to those resources, then you can accomplish planned activities. If you accomplish those activities, then you will deliver a certain amount of product or service. If you deliver those products or services, then your participants will benefit in certain ways. And finally, if the benefits to participants are realized, then certain changes will be apparent in organizations, communities, or systems. So you'll see that at the bottom, they also split this up. There's the planned work, meaning the resources and the activities, and then there's what we hope to get out of it, or the intended results, the outputs, outcomes, and impact. In terms of constructing a basic logic model, while we often read them from left to right, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to construct it from left to right. In fact, it often helps to start by thinking about the results. Focus on the goal. And in many cases, these will be the clearest things that people will have in mind even before going into the project. Often, in fact, they're the reason for setting the process in motion in the first place. So going into a project, you want to improve student preparedness for college and careers. That could be the result. That could be, in some cases, it may be more of an outcome or a short, medium, or long-term outcome. In some cases, it will be the impact. Again, improving student preparedness for 21st century careers is really kind of a very broad and long-term societal impact. Either way, though, very helpful to think about those goals and those results in the first place. Then you can think generally about what are some of the strategies that I can use to get the results I want. And it's not just about what strategies do you want to use. It's really also about then knowing what does the research say, what are the best practices, or what strategies will actually or have been proven to help bring me to the results that I'm looking for. And then once you've come up with your general ideas on strategies, you can certainly work on populating the activities that are required to, that would be the main part of those strategies, the outputs that you hope to achieve, and the inputs or resources that will be needed to create those activities in the first place. As you work through this process, especially if you were to sit and go through it and try to think about it in the terms of your particular project, it often becomes clear that there are other pieces of the puzzle besides the ones that we've discussed so far. So for instance, how do you know that the strategies you've defined are likely to lead to the intended results? I just mentioned this a little bit in bringing up the necessity of relying on certain evidence base or background knowledge. At the same time, how will you know when your results have been achieved? So while the different boxes that you see here are kind of the core components of a logic model, there are also a number of other pieces that are maybe not traditionally included in a logic model, but that are key to the process of thinking through what it looks like. So this slide includes all of them. You see in the middle the orange, green, and pink boxes are the ones that we've talked about so far. Inputs, outputs, outcomes. They don't have the separate impact box, but that's included there under long-term outcomes. It also, though, has these other components that are good to think about. The first one being this on the left-hand side, the problem statement or situation. So it's very important to start off with a clear problem statement that articulates what are the priorities for the project. That is, what is the situation we're trying to remedy? And what are the community needs or other sources of evidence of those needs that we can use when we're figuring out what we want to do next? Next, we have assumptions. And this is a really important part of the process of modeling. Components that we bring with us, we being the stakeholders who are involved with the project planning and implementation, the components that we bring with us that set the context for what the logic model will do. One main benefit, actually, of the logic modeling process is to help make some of these assumptions much more explicit. This can take the form of beliefs. So for instance, all students are capable of becoming college and career ready. It can take the form of knowledge from research, experience, theory, knowledge that is, for instance, about what are the most effective strategies to promote student learning or higher level thinking. So in making these assumptions, in some cases it can actually be challenging or hazardous to the process when they include misinformation, lack of knowledge, or wishful thinking. So it's very helpful to surface these assumptions at the start of the process, make sure everyone's on the same page, make sure that assumptions are leading to actions or steps in the logic model that will actually be useful for the whole process. There are also external factors, of course. These could be things like requirements for programs that are set by funders or sponsors that will impact what the project looks like and how it's formed. It could be, again, resources that will or will not be available to help with the process. So if you know that there's going to be a shortage in the budget next year, that could influence how you define what the activities are that you're hoping to carry out or what the outputs are that you're looking to achieve. That can also include the policy context. Now that can be part of your logic model if you're looking to change that, but it's also an external factor that can either help move the process forward or it can actually be a limiting factor in some cases. And finally, the part that we'll talk much more about in just a short time, evaluation. So this can help understand the results of the process. There's, of course, formative evaluation to help improve the project, offering information that's used to help make continuous improvements. And then there's summative evaluations to help prove what has gone on in the project or generate conclusions about whether it was able to achieve the intended results and how well those results actually came about. So before we move on into another period for reflection, I did want to just note that logic models, while this is already fairly complicated, they can actually be much more complicated than the basic one that's outlined here. You can have different levels. You can have a community level and a, as you see here, kind of more community, the overall community level and then the particular programmatic level. Multiple activities can in this case lead to overlapping outputs and a range of outcomes. You can have different levels of government or different levels of program, multiple agencies working in tandem. And so there are many different ways to map out the process, including by representing what the cycle is of continuous improvement and how the evaluation feeds back into the initial outputs and activities. But for now, let's keep it simple. So this is a helpful chart to start thinking for yourself about how the basic logic model components can apply to your project. So why don't we take, I'm going to pause here for a minute. I'd like to take just a couple minutes for you to think through, either talk about it with the group or just to jot down again some notes on each of these different pieces. I don't expect that you'll come to any sort of conclusion about these different pieces or come to any final logic model in these couple minutes, but do start to think about what are different areas that you know the answers to right away, what are ones that might require a little more digging, particularly when it comes to the outcomes and impact statements.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So as they're talking about it, Laura, I'm just thinking we can talk through a couple of points as well. So as you look at resources, I'm applying it directly to the project we just put the proposal together for. So when we think about what do we need to accomplish a set of activities, in our case, we were looking at designing some interventions around STEM careers, and one of the resources was getting accurate labor market information. So that would be a type of resource we would need, right? And then for activities, we were talking about how to bring together employers and educators in higher ed to look at that data and start thinking about the different pathways to support youth in kind of increasing their math and also interest in STEM careers through work-based learning and also through early college. So then the output, which is the part where it's, unfortunately I think we didn't fill in as much space, is really, so what would be the point of it? And one was that we would have a protocol for how to have those community conversations. But then also there might be a list of what the challenges are, as well as opportunities being perceived as we work with those different groups, as they start to think about how do we articulate with the district, how do we think clearly with creating work-based learning opportunities, what are the challenges around that, and having that as kind of a product as an output that then when we think about the short and long-term outcomes, I guess it would be how to think about getting those in place, and then when they are in place, seeing whether they're having the intended impact. Are we seeing more youth becoming interested in and really sticking with a STEM kind of career interest? Mm-hmm. So that kind of, it's interesting to see how it lays out in there. I think filling in those boxes can be a really effective way then to really think through what we're doing as an activity, but then being able to communicate that to a larger audience.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, so this chart and a lot more templates and forms like it are actually included. You see the source at the bottom there. This is from that Kellogg Foundation guide, Logic Model Development Guide. Very useful source for things like just sorts of prompts, charts, ways to think through the process for yourself.
That's great.
So looking at the time, I think it's probably best that we keep going. Unless anyone has a question, certainly feel free to jump in. But I did want to make sure that we get, especially to the evaluation part. So I'm going to go rather quickly through the next piece, not because it's unimportant, just because I think it's, people are at different stages in the project. So this might not be quite as important right now. But when we're talking about the modeling process, it is always good to hear from a range of participants in actually creating the logic model. Often the modeling process can be even more valuable sometimes than the end result, because it can lead to those conversations that air different assumptions and create that sort of buy-in among all the different stakeholders that lead the logic model to be useful. So for instance, when we're talking about differences in assumptions and differences in what people assume are the impacts of particular, or the outcomes from particular activities, if you think about what are the intended results from implementing a new science curriculum, you could really see a whole variety of different outcome statements from participants depending on their point of view. So it could be that a new science curriculum is intended to lead to higher test scores, increased student engagement, more critical thinking, or a greater interest in higher level STEM classes. All of those could very well be valuable. All of those certainly could be outcomes that we're looking for, but maybe those aren't all things that we're interested in, and it just means that everyone's coming in with a slightly different perspective on what the activities are intended to achieve. So going through the process will allow people to air their beliefs, air their understandings, and together, work together to hammer out the theory of change or the idea behind why we're doing what we're doing. So I'm not going to, again, take too much time right now to think about this, but as you're going through creating a logic model, you might also want to consider how you can use the process of creating a logic model, or even if you have one already, revisiting an existing model to generate additional buy-in for the project. And not mentioned here, but as I just talked about, also, how can you use this process to air what the assumptions are that may not be the same among different participants in the process. So we're moving on to the evaluation piece, which again I know is a crucial part for the researchers and the districts that are participating in MICCR, so I wanted to spend a little more time on this one. With this project, with this project being MICCR, one of the key questions is likely to be, if you are going through the process of a logic model, how will it help improve project evaluation? So ideally, evaluation conversations are built into the process of developing a logic model in the first place. However, even if the project is already underway or if the logic model has already been developed, it's still helpful or possible to think about evaluation and tie it back in with the earlier components of the project. So what does effective evaluation look like? Feel free to jump in if people have any thoughts. For my characteristics, so timely, meaning that it comes out in a time period that is actually makes it useful or usable for others. Accessible to the target audience, the people who we want to understand what the evaluation means and why we're carrying it out. That it can lead to different recommendations, whatever those might be. Could be replication, bringing projects to scale, et cetera. And it responds to whatever the needs and interests are of those who are involved with the project. So this is a pretty complex document, but I think it's worth taking a minute or so on because it is showing that evaluation is such a key underpinning of the entire logic model. So as you'll see on here, questions that can be evaluated arise at every stage of a project and can be highlighted at different stages of the logic model. So all the way over to the left, you see under the needs section, you can do a needs or asset assessment. What exactly is the problem that's facing this, or the situation that's facing the district? What are the potential external barriers or facilitators, things that will help move the project along or keep it from progressing? What's most appropriate to do at that stage? Moving over into the process section, you can look at process evaluation. Is the program being implemented the way that we want it to? Is there fidelity of implementation? Are participants actually being reached? Are they accessing the materials that we're putting out through our activities? And then what are the participants' reactions? How do they feel that these activities are actually being carried out? What are their responses to the outputs? If we go on to the next one, there's outcome evaluation. So how are we, or to what extent are we actually achieving the desired changes? Are our goals being met? Who is benefiting? What's working? And what are any sort of unintended outcomes that may be coming up, even if it's not something that we had planned through the process? And then finally, impact evaluation is, again, these much broader questions. What are the net effects or final consequences? And is the program worth the resources that we've put into it? What changes occurred in the community because of the project? So as you can tell here, this line of thinking, or looking at all these different phases of evaluation questions, can potentially lead to just a huge number of evaluation questions. Already you see on here about 12 different types of questions, and each of these could be further broken down. So when prioritizing topics for evaluation, certainly it's important to think about things like which component of the logic model is the one that we want to focus the most on. Are we most concerned about the process, or are we most concerned about the outcomes? Could be one essential way to break that down. Who are the key audiences that are going to be looking at these different evaluation components? What are the questions that those audiences are likely to have? And how will they plan to use that information? So for instance, I won't read through this whole thing, but you can see here just a couple of different sample questions that various audiences might have. So for instance, participants are going to look at, did the project or the program help me? How can it be better next time? Whereas someone who is in a public office or a funder may be looking at, is the program worth the cost, and is the program working as intended? So again, when we're talking about prioritizing different topics for evaluation, what could be helpful is to think about which questions will the most audiences be interested in? Which will be the most helpful to improve the project? Or which will be most necessary if we're looking more at formative evaluation? What will be the most helpful to evaluate whether the project is effective? After we think about all these different questions, it's also good to answer or to ask ourselves what indicators are actually available. Because while we might have certain questions that we are really interested in answering or hoping to answer through the course of the project, there could just be a lack of evidence or a lack of indicators that are measurable and actually there for us to evaluate. So all of these pieces together are going to go to the question of how do we prioritize evaluation components? So I know we didn't have a whole lot of time earlier for discussion, but what might be useful is to think about what are the key research questions for each part of the logic model. So if you go through the process of carrying out this logic model planning process, what are the different research questions that are most important for us to know? And then, as I just mentioned, who are the intended audience and which of those questions are most important for each of them? So I'll stop here because we only have maybe a couple more slides to go. If we wanted to take just a couple minutes to think through this, or Scott, if you had anything to add. Again, I do know that evaluation is a really important piece of the process for a lot of folks.
Absolutely. So, so Andy, if you're still on the call, or Jean, if you have some questions you want to ask in this, that would be great. Just to think through this.
Are these for general questions?
Yes.
I have my main question here is, are there any resources out there for folks to kind of learn how to facilitate the development of the logic model, especially for evaluators and especially for those that help empower the program staff to build this into their kind of repertoire as a tool for continuous evaluation, systematic evaluation?
Right. That's a really good question. Laura, are you aware of any? Are there some? Yep.
Yes, definitely. I mean, so are you talking more about the actual facilitating conversations or facilitating kind of the process as a whole? There's certainly a whole range out there that I'm sure would accomplish both. I think in terms of the setting out the planning process and kind of the more formal, charts and templates and things, that's easy to find. That's the one that I use, the Kellogg Foundation Guidebook is a very helpful resource. There are, though, other ones that will be probably more comprehensive about actually leading the process, because the Kellogg Foundation one is less about like the modeling process itself than it is about how to actually construct the model.
Right, because I mean, I've taken a stab at one for our program, but it's tough to present it to people without really building their capacity on this process in the first place. So that's what I was wondering, if there was any resource on how to build capacity, I guess, for maybe some professional development and program evaluation.
No, that's a great question. Well, we can certainly, I'll take a look around and see through some of the materials that I'm familiar with, see what might be most helpful for you.
Thank you.
And we're also hoping, this will be this is being recorded, so we're also hoping that this type of presentation will also be a pretty good orientation for groups, even if it's a preliminary one, to kind of get their heads wrapped around the concepts. But I understand what you're saying. We also want to get it to the point that our organizations are thinking in terms of logic models whenever they're thinking of designing and communicating some of the projects that they're interested in doing, or even the projects they are doing. And that's what I've been learning as well, is that anytime I sit down now to figure out a new project, a new grant, a new intervention, I'm always starting with the logic model to see how it lays out. It helps understand the resources that are needed. I can't really build a budget unless I know exactly what costs may be involved. It helps me do that. But it also lets me know what's missing, who do I need to bring to the table, what additional knowledge base do I need. And so I think you're right. there is a certain amount of professional development that goes with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Livonia is letting us know.
Track some of those.
Livonia is also letting us know that all of these resources we'll have on the recorded webinar. We'll also have the we'll make sure we post the not only the link but the access to the Kellogg Foundation, and we'll have the points and things online as well. So we'll have that in a separate website.
Yes, there is a link in the presentation as well, but we'll certainly send out more.
Yeah. Okay.
Great.
All right. So I see Jeannie is typing, but wasn't sure if when she gets done we can respond to her question. But any other? Want to move on? Then we've got just a couple minutes left.
Just a couple more slides actually. So we're moving on now. The very last part is just the common pitfalls. Just because something is in a logic model doesn't mean that it's right or that it will happen. I think that's an important piece to note before we finish. As you see in the cartoon here, if your logic model is projecting that a miracle will occur, it probably is not going to be that useful. So putting it out is a good process to engage in. It doesn't necessarily mean that things will, of course, happen the way that you project. And there are a couple common challenges or a couple of common problems that are worth noting. One is with plausibility. So as you see here, I stop driving my car, therefore emissions decrease, and therefore global temperatures stop rising. Looking at each of these kind of individually, the cause and effect relationships might hold, but overall I think no one's going to necessarily agree that because I stop driving my car that we're going to prevent or halt climate change. Other logic models, the problem is not necessarily about plausibility, but feasibility. Is it reasonable? Is this a project that we actually can accomplish or an activity that we can undertake? If we require 4 hours of physical education each day, sure, childhood obesity will probably decline. However, that's not really something that's worth bringing up because it's not a challenge or not a program that's likely to be implemented. So beyond these two, these are both more problems with the actual process of laying out the arrows and the causality. There are also just other issues where the logic model may not be a very useful resource depending on how it's put in place and how it's constructed. This is not to undercut the argument from before where we were talking about all the various wonderful reasons why logic modeling is important. This is just to say that the way the logic model is constructed might mean that it's not the most useful tool. So one of the common issues is if there's too much or on the flip side too little complexity and detail, you have to decide and think about as you're going into the process, what are the boundaries of specificity that you're looking for? Sometimes it doesn't connect to the external context. So you can have a wonderful program, but if no one was engaged or if there were not enough stakeholders engaged with the process of creating it, or if it just doesn't reflect what the reality is on the ground, it might actually never come to pass. Similarly, when you're laying out that initial problem statement, it could just fail to account for what is the actual situation or the actual challenge that you're facing. So if you're misidentifying the problem, chances are then the solution that you're advocating for or putting in place isn't necessarily going to really get at the underlying issues. And finally, you can have misaligned methods of evaluation. So it's important to know what you're looking for, what you're looking to measure in order to build that component into the logic model. That will help you tell the whole story of the project and explain why the results that you're seeing actually came to pass. So just to wrap things up, logic models, as you see here, can be extremely useful tools for project design, planning, implementation, and evaluation, can help with buy-in or investment in a project, clarifying what it's for, strengthening accountability, and improving evaluation. And as I mentioned earlier, it's never too late to think about how the modeling process and the logic model can support the project. So with that, here, as promised, is a link to the logic model development guide that I've cited a number of times. I've also used a lot of materials from this University of Wisconsin extension program. They have some good handbooks. They actually have a very comprehensive curriculum that is intended for people who are studying this as a discipline. So that could be good to go through as well. And then finally, I just included my contact information on here. I'm happy to be an external reviewer if you're ever looking for someone just to bounce ideas off of, or if you're looking for further information and would like additional resources.
That's great.
So with that said, I know we don't have a ton of time left, but if anyone had questions or reflections that they wanted to share now, feel free.
Well, I just think, Jeannie did put something out in terms of her comment, which I think is on target as well. that a lot of these logic models happen in collaboration, and that it's really important that if we're working in a collaborative way, that we're making sure that, especially if we're working with schools, that the logic model is leveraging the needs of those schools, if it's a district, if it's the state. What is it that they're needing most, and can we make sure that we are designing this in a way that fits their needs? We can always, there's things that can happen out of it, but if we're not helping them feel that this is something leveraging the core outcomes and the core and responsive to their own particular situation, it's likely that we could have a situation where we've got a great model, but it just isn't feasible because the district or the state organization just can't see the relevance to or how it fits. So,
absolutely, yep.
Jeannie's got a great situation that she's working with, and Jeannie, I think we'll go offline to really brainstorm with you and your district partner to kind of think through some possibilities on it, because I think there's an exciting research project that we can put together.
Mm-hmm. Great.
All right. Well, Laura, I want to thank you for this. This was fabulous. It was very insightful. I know we're right at the hour. Unfortunately, I'm caught between things, so I think Jeannie's typing and Livonia, so you guys could certainly finish. I'm going to have to step off to go give a quick presentation here. But really appreciate your time. This was an excellent overview of logic models, and I'm looking forward to getting it out on our website so we can have others come in and watch it virtually.
Great. Well, thank you. I was glad for the opportunity to present, and certainly happy to be helpful going forward if there's any way I can help, like I said, think through individual projects or logic models.
Thank you very much, guys.
So,
thank you.
Yeah, and looks like you've got Jeannie and Livonia chatting here, so if you want to follow up, but otherwise I will step off, but thank you again.